Testing, testing. Should that be working now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on shaping policy across the 4 nations. My name's Will White. I'm the Sustainable Farming Coordinator at Sustain, which is an alliance for better food and farming, and I'll be your chair for today's session. Devolution makes perfect sense when it comes to agriculture. Decentralising governments to empower nations to be able to shape their own agricultural policy according to their own individual cultural and physical landscape is a no-brainer. I'm sure I don't need to remind the audience of the blunt, unspecific and broad policies which came with the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. Arguably, the biggest so-called Brexit benefit that we can have lies in the ability for nations to determine their own fate when it comes to farming, and also to embrace the responsibility to create a farming policy sphere which works for food, planet, nature, and people. This session today is going to aim to look where we are now, nearly 4 years after our departure from the EU, and we hope to disentangle some of the positives and negatives, the challenges and opportunities which come with devolution. And with us is a fantastic panel to help us do that. And I'm going to hand over to each panel member to give a brief introduction of themselves and to also tell us about their individual nation's current state of play when it comes to farming. Then we'll have a quick 30-minute discussion and then open it up for questions from the floor and those watching online. If I could start with you, Phil, on the context in Northern Ireland.
Can everyone hear me okay? Hello. Hi, so I'm Phil Carson. I am with the Nature Friendly Farming Network, and I've been working with the team in Northern Ireland for quite some time. And I just wanted to check, is there anyone here from NI in the audience? Great, okay. 1, perfect. So everyone else will be treated to the weird and wacky worlds of Northern Ireland farming and a little bit of Northern Ireland politics. So I think it's quite important within this debate around food and farming policy to set a bit of context around the political situation, which I'm sure some of you have seen isn't necessarily ideal. And we've been through a number of periods of, I suppose, political instability and political uncertainty. So at the moment, there are talks ongoing around the restoration of our assembly and our executive, and that has followed from 2 years of lack of government. So it makes it quite difficult to get things done. It makes it quite difficult to progress policy. And this is not the first time that this has happened. So we had a period of, I suppose, no assembly, no government, no institutions between 2017 and 2020 as well. But within that, we have seen some progress on food and farming policy, and civil servants in Northern Ireland have done a pretty stellar job in terms of setting some direction of travel. So in 2017, they convened stakeholders to try and develop, I suppose, the draft principles behind a future policy framework. And this centred around environmental sustainability, resilience, supply chain functionality, and then also improved productivity as well. And that went to consultation in 2021 and was signed off very, very quickly at the start of 2022. So there is a draft framework of which civil servants are able to implement some of that. So it's quite interesting that we don't have a government, but we do have some movement. I wanted just to set a little bit of context as well in terms of what makes Northern Ireland a bit different from a farming perspective, because I suppose each of the devolves all talk about how different they are in these conversations. So I'm going to say why we're the most different. So obviously we are unique in that we have a border with the EU, and trade is really, really heavily linked within that. So that's quite a complex arrangement, and obviously in terms of the Windsor Framework, Northern Ireland Protocol, and the agreement in terms of leaving the EU, that was obviously a big sticking point. Agriculture is also more dominant in terms of economic output than the rest of the UK, so it represents about 5% of total economic output. It also covers a very large area of our landmass, so it's about 75%. I think it's only Wales is maybe ahead of us on that front. And we also have quite a focused export sector as well. So about 80% of what we produce is exported. And we have this saying that we produce enough food to feed 10 million people, and that's seen as, I suppose, a real mark of pride, but that has consequences as well. So those are kind of the points that, yeah, are unique in that space, and I suppose influence the design of policy as well. And I'm just going to talk about some of the detail of that future policy framework, which I mentioned before. And I'm going to do a bit of a Wild West situation of the good, the bad, and the barmy/ugly. And I've kind of mentioned about the fact that we actually have some movement on agriculture policy, and I think that should be commended. It's very, very difficult circumstances, and to see some detail and some of that being implemented is positive. And one of the things I suppose that you may have seen is the project or the scheme to baseline soil health in Northern Ireland. So we have a scheme, soil nutrient health scheme, which is being rolled out across the country, which will provide basic soil testing for farmers to look at nutrient balances, but also to look at soil organic carbon. And we also have LiDAR mapping to look at runoff risk in terms of water, and also above ground carbon stores as well. This has been quite a successful scheme. We're seeing uptake of 90% of farmers getting involved in that, and that's because it's tied to a future area-based payment. So we're leading the way in some respects in terms of that baselining, and that should provide data in terms of informing decisions on the farm. The other element of the policy, which I think is a positive, is this commitment to introduce a farming with nature package, it's called, which is essentially the equivalent of ELMS, or the Sustainable Farming Scheme in Wales, and that will replace our current agri-environment scheme, which is the Environmental Farming Scheme. And this is intended to roll out in 2026, we've been told, and it will provide support for delivering environmental land management. The issue with it is that we are awaiting more detail on that, and it requires ministerial sign-off to deliver some of that. So 2026 is the goal, but it's not necessarily going to be what we see. So we have seen some progress in very difficult circumstances, and we have a framework which we have to work towards. The bad, which I'll kind of focus on for a very short period of time, we're the only part of the UK which doesn't have a commitment to or has actually enacted any domestic legislation to underpin agriculture policy. So all payments within Northern Ireland are legally underpinned by a schedule within the UK Agriculture Act. And in Scotland, Denise will tell you about their agriculture bill. Wales has an act, and obviously the UK Agriculture Act applies to England. So this schedule, it makes it a little bit difficult to really understand what the purpose of farm payments are for. The payment principles within that, there's no transition period or legally bound transition period. And that doesn't provide, I suppose, the clarity that we need or a timeline for action. And it means that things could slip and could continue to slip. And that's something that we're very concerned about in that space as well. The other element of the policy, which I suppose is a cause for concern, is the focus on resilience, and resilience is hugely important, but we're continuing to use quite blunt area-based payments to deliver that resilience. And it's an interesting point within the consultation. It makes the point that area-based payments can stifle productivity, can stop innovation, but we still kind of need them, and we need to kind of calculate a level where we're not stifling innovation, but we're still providing a safety net. And then you have that comparison from other parts of the UK which have decided to move away from them entirely. So that doesn't necessarily make sense, I suppose, whenever you're looking at it. And then also we've got some very, very high levels of detail on soil nutrient health and other schemes, but relatively little detail in terms of our agri-environment or generational support and things like that. So some elements of the policy are very well designed, others are yet to come, and in this period of political stasis, it's quite difficult to know when they're going to come in. I'll move on to the ugly very briefly before I pass on, and there's some schemes within the framework which, from our perspective, are a cause for concern. And one in particular is, I suppose it's relatively well known back home, is the Beef Sustainability Package. And this is a scheme that really focuses on trying to drive down livestock emissions, but the focus on that is very much in maximising efficiency and putting animals through the system quicker, faster to try and reduce methane emissions. So there's there's quite a high level of carbon tunnel vision, and it isn't necessarily joined up with the potential implications for biodiversity, for example, or even the financial implications for farmers as well. 62% of our land is allocated as less favoured area, so those are areas which find achieving improvements in productivity quite difficult. So trying to meet the requirements of that scheme might be a bit of a challenge. So that's really the only really ugly part. The last bit, which may have come to the attention of some people in the audience, is some of the situations around water quality in Northern Ireland. And some of you may have seen the situation in Lough Neagh, which is the largest freshwater loch in Europe. And we're seeing a big challenge in terms of algal blooms. And there's many factors for that, but agriculture is a driving cause. And it has created quite a lot of political attention in terms of what we do to try and address that. And some elements of this scheme will do it. There's others which I think are insufficient, and we've got this big challenge at the moment and quite a lot of political attention on agriculture and land use, which from an environmental perspective probably hasn't been that prominent. So there's an opportunity, but again, we need the institutions in place to actually start delivering on some of this, and quite importantly, we need the right budget, we need the right scheme. So that is it. I will pass on to Denise.
And if people want to see the Lough Neagh pollution, we have a brilliant map over there which shows the poultry pollution all around the loch. It's pretty stark if you want to go have a look. Denise, could you please give a quick introduction and the context for Scotland, please?
Great, thank you, Will. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Denise Walton. I'm a farmer from southern Scotland. We're organic, pasture for life certified, and I'm Scottish chair of the Nature Family Friendly Network. So just to give you a feel for where we are in developing agricultural policy post-Brexit, the Scottish Government set a very fast pace about 2 or 3 years ago on the publication of the Vision for Agriculture, which was pitching Scottish agriculture to be a global leader on sustainable and regenerative farming. Then, of course, in September, we had the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill published, and it's slightly complicated. A 3-tier system, requiring a code of practice, a very expensive bill, which we feel will definitely answer the need for nature-friendly farming if it's fulfilled and completed. So that's a sort of broad sense of where we are. But so culturally, we're very different. Culturally, 86% of Scotland is what was used to be called less favoured area, and actually is now more referred to as high nature value farming, a lot of which is in our crofting counties. So we've got crofting as a very important cultural food producing and land use element. Our food production also is sort of globally about whiskey, about producing grain for the whiskey industry, salmon farming, which of course is also dominant in our crofting counties. We're also good grass producers, and we produce very good beef. So just the bill commits to the production of high quality food, addressing issues of climate mitigation and adaptation, and nature restoration and rural development. And certainly our Cabinet Secretary has been very consistent and persistent when lobbied by other interests that farming for nature and food production go hand in hand. They're not separate. They're one and the same thing, which of course sings our tune in the Nature Family Farming Network. It's a framework legislation which gives ministers flexibility to co-develop with farmers and land managers, which of course, is kind of really what we all want. It means that we can be quite creative about it. And we like to feel in the NFFN that we slightly influence the inclusion in the bill of an opportunity for farmers to become much more involved in the co-development. But the downside is that if ministers can be flexible, they can kind of slide things in and out without a lot of scrutiny. So we're actually really wanting more scrutiny built into the bill. Our Rural Affairs and Islands and Land Reform committee is taking evidence from a wide range of stakeholders. It's had 2 evidence-gathering sessions, and Ewan, who's here in the audience, who's our Scotland lead, gave evidence on the 20th of December about issues about how, first of all, the first committee looked at how the bill could be framed and legislated for. There was quite a lot of discussion about the definition of regenerative and agroecology, discussion about the code of practice. Should it be a legal code of practice? We need to have a definition before we can have a code of practice. And then the second evidence was about embedding nature-based farming into the system. So a wide range of stakeholders have been addressed, all with a mandate for Scottish farming and land interests. So when we get to the nitty-gritty of how the bill is going to be kind of constructed, it has 4 tiers. Tier 1 is base payment, very much as is. Tier 2 is, if you like, it's an enhanced base payment, a little bit as we have now, which is the EECS, the Agriculture, Environment, Climate Scheme. So not huge difference there. It all starts getting really interesting and creative with tier 3 and 4. Tier 3 is elective, so farmers can elect to do specific improvements on their farms for mitigating climate change and improving nature. Tier 4 is complementary. That's where continuous professional development, knowledge transfer, peer-to-peer come in. But the big issue is money. So we've had 68 million slashed from our agriculture bill recently. We've been promised that the money will be returned. They haven't quite said when. But if we don't have the money, we cannot implement this very ambitious, very expensive bill that we absolutely need for nature-friendly farming in Scotland. Tier 1 is likely to take something like 75% of the funding. If it goes into tier 2, it's much the same. When we get to tier 3 and 4, funding is going to be probably very diminished. Going back to the issue of code of practice, which is really core to how the bill is going to be implemented, the code of practice is going to need professional development, peer-to-peer learning, but if we don't have the funding for tier 4 for CPD on code of practice, then the code of practice, which is, if you like, a headline issue for our bill, isn't going to be fulfilled. So there's quite a lot yet to be ironed out. But certainly we are optimistic. It's an ambitious bill. The Scottish Government have listened to us, but obviously there's a lot more to be done. Okay, over to Wales.
Thank you very much. Rhys, could you give us the context for Wales, please?
Of course, yeah. Well, pnawn da bawb, Rhys Evans dwi. I'm Rhys Evans. I'm the Wales manager for NFFN Cymru, also farm with the family in Rhydymain, in y Dolgellau in North Wales. Who here is from Wales, actually? Hands up. Oh, quite a few. Enthusiastic one in the back there. Yeah, there's a lot going on in Wales, so if I go over my time, do tell me to shut up, okay? But there's a lot that has happened in the last year and a lot that is incoming as well. As Phil mentioned, we do have an agricultural act in Wales, so we're a bit ahead of the game compared to Northern Ireland and Scotland. So that act, the Wales Agricultural Act, received royal assent August last year. And essentially, it's an enabling piece of legislation that gives Welsh Government the powers to support agriculture in Wales. And it sets out the framework for that future support and sort of lists the activities and outcomes that will be linked to farming support in the future. And so the framework for farming in Wales in the future will be the Sustainable Land Management Framework, and that's the United Nations definition. And I'll read it out. It's the use of land resources, including soil, water, animals, and plants, for the production of goods to meet changing human needs, while simultaneously ensuring the long-term potential of these resources and the maintenance of their environmental benefits. Okay, so that's the sort of framework that will guide policies and schemes in Wales. And that is underpinned by 4 sustainable land management objectives. The first one, to produce food in a sustainable manner. to mitigate and adapt to climate change, to maintain and enhance the resilience of ecosystems and the benefits they provide, and lastly, to conserve and enhance the countryside and the cultural resources and promote public access to and engagement with them, and to sustain the Welsh language and promote and facilitate its use. So, not a lot, eh? So that sets the context into sort of how schemes and policies in Wales in the future will be sort of delivered. And the main vehicle for meeting a lot of these objectives and outcomes will be the Sustainable Farming Scheme. Now this has been in development for a few years now. Some of you might remember the first Brexit and land consultation that came out in 2018, a fairly divisive piece of consultation. But essentially, the SFS, which we now are in the final so the final consultation of the Sustainable Farming Scheme, I hope, will be, that was launched just before Christmas and runs up until March. So that's the final opportunity to try and influence the scheme, if you like. So it's centred on the 4 sustainable land management objectives, along with 15 sustainable land management outcomes. These are sort of cross-cutting, but 8 of them are essentially sort of linked to the environment, with 7 looking at sort of farm performance and socio-economic objectives. And the framework that they're adopting for the Sustainable Farming Scheme is a sort of 3-tiered approach, where sitting above sort of regulation and national minimum standards, there will be a universal sort of payment, a baseline area-based payment for farmers to deliver 17 mandatory actions. Okay, so I won't list them all, but some include like benchmarking, soil testing, animal health planning, cover cropping, hedgerow management, some biosecurity measures, etc. And there are 2 scheme rules as well. The first being that 10% of the farm must be managed as habitat, and 10% of the farm must be in the woodland or tree cover. And these are by far, particularly the latter, the targets around tree planting, by far the most contentious piece of the Sustainable Farming Scheme. Most policy discussions I've been involved with have been sort of dominated by those 2 targets. But essentially, I think of this sort of universal action tier as a development almost, an evolution of the basic payment scheme, where it's an area-based payment that every farmer will receive for undertaking actions. But this is significantly more ambitious than the basic payment scheme. And then the second tier will be sort of optional actions. So things that farmers can do to go above and beyond the universal action. And there's not a concrete list within the consultation, but some of the options might include like planting more trees, creating more habitat, native breed payments, water harvesting, stuff for public access, and capital support maybe to diversify horticulture or renewable energy. So that's almost like an evolution of the Glassdair agri-environment scheme we have in Wales. So you'll have a menu of options that you can dip into and get a payment for doing that. And then the final tier is the collaborative layer, where farmers can work together with other farmers across a sort of catchment or landscape scale. And I guess that would be similar to some of the interventions like Sustainable Management Scheme that we had in Wales, or the Nature Fund. And some of the interventions there might be sort of to control non-native invasive species across a catchment scale, natural flood management, adding value to the supply chain, knowledge transfer and exchange, or sort of specific species management across the landscape. So this SFS is going to be introduced in 2025. The optional actions and the collaborative actions, they will be introduced likely at a later date. So the Welsh Government have indicated sometime around 27 or 2028, which is a bit of a concern because we would like to see them introduced as soon as possible. And just to touch on the transition period as well. So there are plans in the consultation to transition away from the basic payment scheme. Yeah. So in 2025, farmers will have the option to either sign up for the Sustainable Farming Scheme or the basic payment scheme. And once you're in the Sustainable Farming Scheme, you won't be able to go back into the basic payment scheme. And they're planning to phase out the BPS over 5 years, starting in 2025. So if you go into the BPS in 2025, it will be at 80% of what it is currently, with a 20% reduction every year. So there will be no basic payment scheme in 2029. And if your SFS payment is lower than the basic payment scheme, Welsh Government are proposing a stability payment to sort of top up that gap. So you're not at a disadvantage, if you like, if you're going into the SFS. Believe it or not, we actually have another scheme that has come out this year. Publishing the Agricultural Act and devising a new scheme, as if that's not enough work. There's another scheme, it's called the Habitat Wales scheme. So that is a one-year scheme, essentially created to plug that gap when agri-environment schemes finish. So all Glasgow agri-environment schemes in Wales came to an end at the end of last year. So there'll be an interim scheme to sort of plug that gap, if you like. It's open to all farmers, 10 habitat types within that scheme. It's an all-or-nothing scheme, essentially. If you have those 10 habitat types on your farm, you have to enter the scheme. You can't take those habitats out unless under exceptional circumstances. And there are payment rates attached to it, so £69 per hectare for habitats and £62 per hectare for woodland. And there's tapering payments, so after 200 hectares, you will receive 50% of that payment, and anything beyond 400 hectares, it will be 10% of the hectare. There's no tapering for common land. There's no capital works option as well. So yeah, there's a lot going on. And I think hopefully that just gives you a flavour of where we're at with schemes and the sort of context. And hopefully we can discuss some of the concerns afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rhys. Martin, you've just got back from a meeting with Mark Spencer, so you should be able to give us some very up-to-date info on how it's going in England at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. That's what. So I'm Martin Lyons. I'm an asset manager of natural capital, producing a range of goods and services society wants. In other words, a farmer. And those goods and services and produce is changing, and that focus needs to change in what we deliver going forward. Many of us remember back 6 years ago, we had Michael Gove stood on the stage up the road, Health and Harmony, really welcomed that transition and change to where we are today. Kind of that was in the past, and what we've got in the future now is quite different. I was lucky enough to host Michael Gove when he did his piece onto video, and you'll see it on social media and on YouTube bits around where he said standards won't drop for imports. That was done on our farm, and I've reminded him many times of what they've gone and done around trade deals. So what they've promised and what we've been delivered isn't the same, and there needs to be a lot further journey to go. But they have set out a co-design process. Many stakeholders and myself and others have spent thousands of hours engaging and trying to influence this. Originally, we were going to get paid or assisted with some of our time. None of that's ever happened. We've given our time as stakeholders for free to develop it. And that transition has been painful, slow, and going backwards many times. And that's been real frustration of the ambition and the goals being undermined by political movements and other organisations lobbying in to make that change happen. But as of the beginning of this year, we've seen our BPS removed. We have no cushion or safety net around us now as farmers in England. We have a scheme of pick and mix options. They announced today another 50 options around the SFI and stewardship. And starting from this summer, that new scheme or new application space is in one place, and you can do your trees, you can do your countryside stewardship, your SFI and other options through one portal, which is a welcome step because currently there's 300 and some odd different options I can do, 9 different funded schemes, capital grants, productivity grants, supply chain incentivifications. It is so confusing for farmers to look at all this range. It's a pick and mix. There's no guidance around it, no support in actually getting the right outcomes in the right place for nature, for farm businesses and for climate, and joined up. And that's one thing we've been pushing with Mark, and I'm fortunate enough to get some very good access into policymakers within Westminster and the ministers and secretaries of states, and keep pushing these points, really trying to make sure our farming voice as farmers, the practitioners who are trying to deliver this, are there at the heart of these decisions. And we have had some good moments, but we don't get everything we want because other people are also in there trying to steer it in other directions. But we actually recognise that the transition is set out. We've got 2 more years of, on the document they put out, 2 more years of SFI options to come. So we're halfway through of what is coming. So more is to come. So how do we make sure our voices are in there leaning into those options that we need to see, and in a joined up fashion, getting the right sort of farming system recognised and the right rewards and the right balance of funding in the schemes and the design to put it across the whole of England. We've seen the early adoptions of the schemes very much focused around arable systems, not enough around particularly upland, like grassland or less productive landscapes that are less productive for food, but hugely productive and ability to produce for biodiversity, to climate, for flood mitigation. And we've got to get those opportunities recognised and rewarded. So I'm not going to spend too much time, because most people here looking at the hands are from England. You'd have understand where we are and where we're going to. We have no more of the safety net of the BPS. We are in a pick and mix kind of scheme. We need to further develop that. But as a farmer, previously, the assets on my farm were not overly rewarded. The market produce, I had a reward for. Hopefully, going forward, many of those assets that I currently deliver, and they want a lot more delivered around biodiversity, climate, flood mitigation, public access, and the list goes on, we can get a good support for and join that up while we have an improving food market access and reward from food markets, and the supply from that product needs to improve, or else we will see many farmers in England in the less productive landscapes and soils step away from food production because there'll be more market rewards in the environmental outcomes. I'm in Cambridgeshire. We can produce a good 10 tonne of wheat on a good year and 12 on it if we're lucky. The schemes, if they're aimed at me, will overpay other farmers if their average yield is 6 to 8 tonne a hectare. So how do we make a whole of the England market work where we get the right outcomes for the right things and reward the right actions at the right levels across the whole of England? Because we have so many different landscapes and there's so much challenge to come. But talking to the Minister, we're lucky to have a dinner with Mark Spencer, and we've had other engagements with the Secretary of State. They do understand the challenge, but they are pushed very hard by lots of other stakeholders not to go down this journey and focus around food production, food security, and market intervention that sort of gives stability payments. We need a fair market that rewards everything we produce.
Thank you very much, Martin. Denise and Reece, you both mentioned various gaps in funding which we're worried about at the moment with the various environmental schemes. I know in Wales there's been the taking away of the organic support as well. I'd like to ask both of you and all of you, how can we convince governments of the value of farming? How can we show them that farming matters and it's not just an easy thing to cut to fill funding gaps elsewhere? Yeah, Denise, would you like to start?
I wrote to the Deputy First Minister, who's also our Cabinet Secretary for Finance, about our concerns as an organisation following the slash of the funding. And I mean, she quite quickly got back to us with a fairly detailed letter emphasising the government's commitment to the agriculture bill, the acknowledging the need for funding, and that yes, it will be returned, but didn't say when. So there is this. I don't think we need to persuade anymore the value and the need for nature. We still need to be very strong, because obviously there are the other stakeholders who are arguing for food security and all the rest. And we just need to keep battling on, making sure that we get this money back. Because you see also, just a little bit like in Wales, we've got a Good Food Nation Act, and we've also got a biodiversity strategy, and the biodiversity strategy commits to funding for nature. So where's that coming from? So we've got quite a lot of legislation in place that needs funding, and the funding isn't there.
Reece, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, yeah. I'll just mention that sort of more the detail of the Habitat Wales scheme, for example. Because I mentioned some of the objectives and the frameworks within the legislation and the guiding principles of the scheme. I think the words are to be commended. They're really positive words and really sort of bigging up nature-friendly farming, if you like. But actions speak louder than words. And so, for example, with the Habitat Wales scheme, which I know it's just the 1 year scheme, a 12-month scheme, but the funding of £69 per hectare for habitat is considerably lower than what we'd have received under the Glastonbury agri-environmental scheme. So, for example, a hay meadow, you get £154 per hectare under Glastonbury. Salt marsh, 135 hectare. Cover cropping, £600 per hectare. The woodland management one, stock occlusion, £80 per hectare, £78 for woodland pasture. So it's a considerable decrease in income. We did an analysis of 20 farms jointly with the Solely Association and other organisations in Wales, and it was an average 76% reduction in income compared to the Glastonbury agri-environmental scheme within the Habitat Wales scheme. And the best case scenario was a 47% drop in payment, and the worst case being 96%. So yeah, what more can we do really to try and persuade government? Because we take, as part of our job, the farmers in the network, we take Welsh Government, civil servants, members of the Senedd out onto farms to showcase exactly what we do, the multiple benefits of nature-friendly farming involved in different stakeholder groups. I think the Welsh Government, they understand the importance of it, but the money isn't there at the moment. So we need to sort of just carry on arguing the case for nature-friendly farming.
Thanks, Rhys. Phil, did you?
Yeah, I think, is this on? Could I? Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I think when you look at it, because we've been speaking about all of this in a devolved context, and the agriculture budget is reserved, and you've got political parties of all stripes talking about growth, like it's the big agenda, it's how we're going to kind of get out of the difficult times that we're in at the moment. And there was a recent report came out, I think the public health costs alone from obesity are calculated at £98 billion. And you can't have growth with a population that is sick, essentially. We've seen flooding all across the country the last couple of months. Again, that incurs massive costs on society and on farming. And yeah, we need a budget that's more than £3.4 billion. That represents about 3% of just that 98 billion figure. So it's that idea of investing to get all of these benefits and reduce all of these other costs. And I think that's really, really key within all of this, because agriculture is going to come up against health, education. Situation in Scotland, I suppose, is a bit of an example of that. And yeah, we just have to make that message really, really clear.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, Martin, you mentioned trade earlier. Earlier on in the year, certain Somerset MP, who will remain nameless, was advocating for hormone-injected beef imports. I would like to understand, how do you think we can build a sensible, fair, UK-wide trade policy which protects and promotes nature-friendly farming?
Remove many of the MPs from the conversation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they have this concept, because somebody else eats a food product somewhere else in the world, it must be fine to import it and feed our nation. We know that has huge implications for for human health, but also for planetary health and environmental and impacts elsewhere in the world. They want to turn a blind eye to the impacts of our food system in other places. We need clear fundamental standards of food production that we consume, but we can be a global leader in importing produce from other countries to that standard. Unfortunately, old enough, I remember the kite mark many moons ago. The British standards were this kite mark: come and trade with us, and this is what we'll spend our money with you as a country if you meet our standards. And we drove the standards up around the world. Certain MPs want to drive those standards down. That means farmers lose and society lose, and society will end up picking up the bill. And that's where I struggle with talking to many MPs around their global agenda and sort of importing products. They don't realise that unintended, well, it's not unintended, I think it's a conscious problem it's going to cause in the future, but it's not their problem. They won't be in place, they won't have to deal with it. But somebody they may be working with, or a corporation may benefit that they get a sidekick from. I struggle with it, and I constantly trying to push that back. But collectively, all of us really need to become a louder voice in what are our base standards, our food production and our land management, and that should be our underpin everything. And if you import it, you meet those standards, because that's the only way we can trade in the future.
Yep, that's brilliant. Yeah, I agree. Let's do it. Finally, before we open up to the floor, I'd like to ask each of you for one or two specific policy asks or priorities which you'd really like to see enacted in your devolved nation, which you think could make a huge difference over the next few years. Phil, should we start with you? If that mic works.
Hello, yes it does. Yeah, from my perspective, I think there's two things which would really add value within this in a Northern Ireland context and I think would be useful across the piece. And the first one is a properly funded rural development policy, because we've been focusing on land management was actually, like, it's crucial within this, but we also need something that supports supply chains, supports farmers to diversify, supports investment in place so that you kind of get the benefits of food production and environmental land management. Quite often we hear people talking about social outcomes and resilience and things like that, and the automatic response is, yeah, a blunt subsidy, but I think we need to be creative and look at rural development as a priority. The other thing I think which has been overlooked a bit is the opportunity to use public land well. So I think in England alone there's about 2 million hectares of land that's owned by the state. In Northern Ireland, there's a large proportion, I'm sure it's the same in Scotland and Wales. There's big opportunities there, and we talk about knowledge exchange and supporting farmers to kind of demonstrate the art of the possible, and I think public land should be used in the same way, so that governments delivering on their commitments and using that land to kind of instill change on the ground.
So to kickstart where we are, really from a farming perspective, what I'd like to see two congruent things. Something has really got to be done about farmer confidence, so that farmers recognize that actually they are the agents of change and of good change, and that the best change that we can do as farmers with a short time scale is actually work with our soils. So if there's policy that legislates for good soil health management and gives farmers the confidence and the knowledge to know that we are the agents of the best possible change to make the best possible impact in terms of biodiversity and climate mitigation, its soils, and also it can be measured. So if we have to provide measurements of improvement, we can do that. But that's just the kickstart. We also desperately need infrastructure investment into abattoirs, shorter food chains. Our government wants to see 50% of Scotland farmed organically, but we have got a diminishing organic market in Scotland. We've got the main abattoirs like ABP actually relocating their organic slaughtering facilities to England. So we've got no organic slaughtering facilities in Scotland. Our animals go to Durham to an organic abattoir. So that has to be reinvested, because farmers who want to farm organically in Scotland can't, because there's a limited market and there isn't the infrastructure. So that's a sort of two-pronged response to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've mentioned two already. So yeah, a fully funded budget. I think the rural affairs budget in Wales is being slashed by 62 million, I think, for next year. And to introduce those sort of optional and collaborative layers as soon as possible into the sustainable farming scheme. One thing that I think frustrates me with sort of historical agri-environment schemes is the sort of prescriptive nature of they're inherently prescriptive in their nature, I think, agri-environment schemes. And particularly in Wales, we've had sort of lots of one-size-fits-all policies. So for example, under the Glasgow agri-environment scheme, upland management, everything was sort of geared towards driving stocking rates down. And the reason for that was to try and sort of rectify some of the overgrazing issues we had with past policies like headage payments. And where that has happened, we have seen the benefits where heathland and species and habitats have been restored. But there are some areas that weren't overgrazed. It was doing just fine, and undergrazing has become a bit of an issue in Wales at times now, and the dominance of sort of millennia grasslands in our uplands, affecting like the species diversity, but also stuff like ground nesting birds, curlew, golden plover, etc. So it's quite frustrating to have this one-size-fits-all policy that fails to appreciate the nuance and complexities of farming in Wales. We've talked about sort of how farming in Wales might differ from England and the southeast of England, but you've got lots of different farming in Wales as well. And a lot of the prescriptions are based around sort of sward height and complying basically with grazing stocking rates. And I don't think that's a guaranteed recipe for success when it comes to habitat management. So I would like to see the government looking across the sea to Ireland, looking at some of the results-based schemes that they're developing there, looking at more ways of measuring success, like key indicator species, the frequency, etc., and ensuring that the advice and there's someone locally available within the government to help those farmers achieve those results.
Thank you. For me, supported advice and guidance at a landscape scale from farmers, and around that support package of doing the right thing in the right place. As farmers, we've been to universities, lots of us, or educational, where we're taught around production and animal health and production of more. And the future is around balance and farming within the capacity of your landscape. And where does nature fit in? Where do the pollinators and predatory insects? And that's a whole new thing for many farmers to understand. And that's got to be led by advice and knowledge exchange on the ground and peer-to-peer learning and bottom-up approach. So that's really got to happen to drive this change. Post-war, every farm drive had an advisor come down there to tell you how to produce more and take nature off your farm. We need to flip that back round and put that back in place to really drive change over the next 5 to 10 years. The other one would be within our food supply chains and production systems, true cost accounting. Much of the unintended, that's not unintended, the consequences of cheap food production that we're all paying for is not covered by the price of that's come off the farm or the landscape. That unintended consequence must be priced into our food production. So we actually, that causes the most harm becomes the most expensive to eat. That causes the best health from our landscape is the healthiest stuff to eat.
Thanks, Martin. I think both of you, Denise and Martin, have both talked about farmer-to-farmer-led change, and that's why the NFFN are clearly such a good organisation to have here with us today. I'm going to open up to the floor now for questions. We're going to go for online and in person. We'll start in person. We'll go on the gentleman on the left in the green jacket, please.
I have a farm on the banks of the Wye, just inside Wales, which is probably the most polluted river in Great Britain, promoted by the Welsh office, of course. And what I wanted to say was that you have to understand the perspective, the amount of power that farming has got in Wales. For the tens of millions of pounds that is spent by the Welsh office, the percentage of food, all around Wales you see silage bags with "We are feeding a nation." In fact, what's happening is that the farmers of Wales are producing 2% of the food that is consumed in Wales. And there's only 1%. The gross national product of farming in Wales is 1%. And that gives you an idea of how much clout farming has in Wales.
Okay. Rhys, would you like to respond to that?
Was there a question there?
I think it was more of a statement to illustrate the relative importance of farming in
just
Wales.
a point on, I guess, what we produce in Wales that you sort of alluded to. I think, 95% of all the meat that we eat in Wales, it leaves the country, mostly to, I think, 60% or something to England, and then around 30% to the European Union, and a small percentage beyond that. So there's certainly, we've been focusing, I guess, on sort of how we produce food. But it begs another question, doesn't it, as to kind of what food we produce as well. So we're significantly deficient in the amount of fruit and veg that we produce in Wales, for example. I think we only grow enough fruit and veg to meet a quarter of a portion of fruit and veg that is sort of recommended daily allowance. I think with only 2% of farmland, we could meet that. requirement. So certainly we need to look more about what we produce in Wales. And I do have a bit of beef, excuse the pun, with the slogan sort of feeding a nation. But I don't think we necessarily are feeding a nation, particularly in Wales, because most of it is export. So yeah, policies where well-designed policies, food and farming policy should go hand in hand, not just look at sort of how we produce food, but what we produce as well. And yeah, support farmers to diversify into different income streams.
Thanks, Rhys. Phil, did you want to come in on this?
It's just that point on power within the system. I'm not sure it's farmers, but agri-businesses. And in Northern Ireland, we have seen a massive push to expand pig and poultry production and dairy production based on agribusiness kind of lobbying and a co-designed strategy known as Going for Growth. And it hasn't really benefited farmers. It's left them in quite a precarious economic position. And it's the agribusinesses that have driven a lot of this stuff rather than farmers themselves. So it's looking at where that power lies and trying to intervene in the right places, I think.
Great. Do we have any more questions? We'll go on the right over there with Ben, the gentleman with the slip-back hair.
Thank you very much. Ben Reynolds from the UK branch of the Institute for European Environmental Policy. I had a question, I wanted to expand on something that Rhys mentioned earlier. I was just wondering which of the other nations' schemes do you wish you had in your nation, either wholesale or specific elements? And I suppose linked to that, do you see any problems or benefits with this sort of divergence of farm policy, or indeed benefits in future convergence?
Yeah, I think, we talked about the benefits of like devolution. So that gives governments, devolved governments, the flexibility, I guess, to design its own schemes based on specific challenges, needs, different types of farming within those countries. I guess a danger would be, I think, just politics in general. I think that we had a situation in Wales where we had a Welsh Labour government who was proposing a sort of public money for public goods scheme in Wales, and at the same time UK government or English Conservatives essentially proposing the same thing. But in parallel to this, we had the Welsh Conservatives criticising Welsh Labour's policy, and at the same time UK or English Labour criticising UK policy. But in doing so, they're criticising their own party's policies. So I think that in itself is a bit of a frustration in that politics itself has become an exercise in criticising the opposition party. But I guess that's just the nature of the beast we have to live with. I guess the pace of change can be, the pace of change and the ambition between the four countries can be a bit of an issue perhaps. In the sort of Wales are ahead of the game in terms of Scotland and Northern Ireland. A bit more ambition, I think, when it comes to sort of receiving a universal baseline payment. Perhaps in the short term, Welsh farmers might be at a disadvantage, I don't know. But in the long term, certainly, I would think that Welsh farmers would be at an advantage because we're sort of, the mindset is there to change and become more sustainable, I think.
Great. I think we'll go to a couple of online questions now. Hannah?
So the first one follows on actually from this point. So devolution in terms of farming policy is clearly the right way to go. But as well as this, are there also any schemes or channels for collaboration and knowledge sharing across the UK?
Who wants to take this one? Would you like to?
Yeah. It's working. It is. Well, in Scotland, we actually are very much involved in a CATIV-funded project, which is peer-to-peer. And while it's very much in its infancy, the results are really encouraging and phenomenal. So farmer peer-to-peer work. So it's not so much, a downstream progress of better knowledge to people who don't have the knowledge, but actually sharing experiences has been the most encouraging process for actually sharing knowledge and knowledge transfer. But actually on that, if I can also say, because it's part and parcel of the same response, is that there are a lot of farmers and farming which is ahead of policy. So we've got farmers who are leading science, not because they're scientists, but because they're demonstrating, and these are things that are being shared, actually better ways of farming. And we've got farmers who are ahead of policy, and many, many case studies which can demonstrate that actually a lot of us are demonstrating we can do the right thing. And I would also posit that that has become much more active post-Brexit. Not that I support leaving Europe, but I do think that has given us that opportunity.
Thank you. I think we also need a standardisation of how do we measure carbon and biodiversity. Corporates are going to have to record on this, and we can't have 4 different measuring schemes across England, across the UK, England and Scotland. We need similarity because we're all farmers trading together. And it's like that we need those standardised measuring frameworks, because then we can be calling for carbon border tariffs and biodiversity tariffs that need to come in. We currently have a government that's talking about implementing them, but not on food. So let's destroy other countries' production because we can have cheaper food and not care about it. We need that standardisation right across the UK on key principles that build around trade and finance and a model, and then we can do the devolution part.
Yeah, because initially, whenever we left the European Union, there was a commitment or there was acknowledgement of the need for common frameworks between, I suppose, all of the countries to kind of ensure that where there was a need for alignment, you got that. And I think for political reasons, those fell by the wayside, but I think that would be a good place to start. And I think there's just this important principle within this that we're kind of in this experimental phase where we've got the power to kind of develop policies domestically, which hasn't been the case for decades. And there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be so many learnings, there's going to be some things done well in some countries and some things that aren't. And I think some sort of process to enable kind of conversation between organisations, but also the civil service within that respect as well. But that's something that, again, as Rhys mentioned, comes up against the politics of the day.
Yeah. Hannah, we'll take one more from online.
Absolutely. So there's one from Colette Jones. How is land ownership addressed in the food and farming policies in the 4 nations?
How is what, sorry, addressed?
Land ownership.
Who wants to take this one? Phil, do you want to start?
In the sense, in the sense of who owns, I suppose there's no way to kind of,
Well, I guess perhaps we could tease out some of the differences in the way land ownership is, the historic differences which occur and the problems and perhaps some solutions which could happen in each nation.
Yeah, for us, because we have, again, a very unique system of land ownership. So we have very few to no farm business tenancy. So tenancy doesn't really exist. And we have this kind of old and archaic system of Conacre. There's about 30% of the land, and it's a system of renting out on an 11-month period. And that has really impacted, I suppose, long-term decision-making. It's impacted access and implementation of agri-environment schemes, for example. So that's something that needs to be addressed and looked at. And our department has committed to running a pilot to see how you could develop a farming with nature scheme that is coherent with Conacre. There's some arguing that it should be disbanded altogether, but there's a really, really close kind of cultural association with it. And that's a very challenging barrier to overcome. So it'll be interesting to see the outcome of this work from the department.
So in Scotland, of course, we've got land reform, but in terms of the relationship between land ownership or tenure and farming for nature, obviously farming for nature needs long-term positioning and long-term commitment, which it comes with ownership, but also what it does is put a position, if it puts pressure on longer-term tenancies. There is a tendency now for much shorter-term tenancies, which is very problematic for farm businesses and for farming for nature. And we do need longer-term tenancies if possible.
I think in Wales there's a lot of issues around how the scheme works, and particularly the scheme rules work for tenant farmers, but also common land farmers as well. There's a lot of common land and farmers, and I think if the scheme doesn't work for common land and tenant farmers, it won't work at all. So particularly around the 10% tree requirement, a lot of the trees on tenant farms won't necessarily be under the control of the farmer itself or herself. So where does that leave farmers meeting that target? To try and rectify some of these issues, Welsh Government are proposing now sort of annual 12-month contracts as part of the SFS, as opposed to your historic sort of 5-year contract under Glasgow agri-environment scheme. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to talk about some of the sort of socio-economic issues in Wales around sort of overzealous environmental targets, particularly potentially around the tree planting targets in Wales. So we're losing quite a bit of farms. There's a lot of anger amongst farming communities about farmland being bought up and planted with trees. So you're losing sort of the fabric of rural Wales, essentially. So just some stats, for example, like the number of Glasgow woodland creation applicants outside of Wales grew from like 3% to 8% in 2022, and the average planting area for Welsh applicants 17.3 hectares, which is very small compared to the average size for non-Welsh applicants, which was 96.3 hectares. So there's a danger that Wales becomes a sort of a country where you can just plant trees to offset your own emissions or a pension pot for someone elsewhere. So yeah, there needs to be consideration for the social and cultural aspects of any country when you're devising environmental policies.
And given the rich history of the Welsh language and small Welsh hill farms, etc., it's vitally important, especially in Wales. Just on that, I've seen a few various news articles about private equity firms seeing potential carbon credits as an asset, and that could lead to the agglomeration of various small farms. Do you see that as a threat in Wales?
I mean, personally, I would shy away from selling any of my carbon. We have had a carbon assessment done on the farm. It showed that we were carbon negative, so we were sequestering more carbon than we were emitting. But that has been questioned by some academics in Bangor University. So until I know for sure that I have surplus carbon to sell, then it's staying on my farm. It's not going elsewhere. And there might be an obligation in the future for individual farms to be net zero. There's an industry-wide target to achieve net zero. At the moment, there's no legal obligation for my farm to be net zero, but in the future there might be. So I'm keeping hold of it for the time being. Yeah.
Probably a good plan. Matt, did you want to come in this, or shall we go for more questions on the floor? Okay, yeah. In the middle here, gentlemen.
Tony Davis, a farmer in Wales. My really simple question, we've talked about the 4 different devolved governments. On a score of 1 to 10, how would each of you score your own devolved governments on basically, reaching that ambition of nature-friendly farming post-Brexit?
Given Martin has just met.
Anyone from Welsh Government here?
For reasons of diplomacy, maybe we'll skip that one. You think it's okay? Yeah. All right, Phil, you go first.
Right. Weighing it up in my mind. 4.5 with extenuating circumstances. So yeah, that's for me.
Yeah, I'd say 7.5. Yeah, I'm an optimist.
The Habitat Wales scheme, probably a 3 or a 4.
Yeah.
But the SFS going in that direction, a cautious 7 for the time being, and see how fully funded it is and the payment rates.
And knowing what we've got and possibly what's coming, and if we can influence that in the right way, I'd say 7 to 8. We've got to get this framing right, and we've got to make sure nature-friendly farming is a system that works for everybody and all things. And we must make sure those that are lobbying against that kind of focus and system get drowned out.
Right.
And I do see some good stuff coming, but we need to be actively engaging to make sure it's delivered right.
Great. So generally positive with some caveats. Any other questions? Yes, on the right-hand side here. Yes, you. Sorry. Can we get a microphone over to the lady in the 3rd row at the right?
Yeah, I was quite interested in getting a sense, maybe particularly from Martin. with an election this year and a potentially new government, what are you anticipating being either continuation or changes that might be coming in terms of the policy development that's currently underway?
That's going to get interesting. So we can't predict what the future will be and which party or mix of parties will be in. But if you look at the stats, Labour coming in, they've not been very clear in actually what they are going to deliver around food, farming, nature and the schemes. They do want to understand the value of what's been paid for already. So they do want to do a sense check of, are we spending public money and getting the right outcomes, and what are we measured to make sure we are on that journey? Because we haven't done any baseline scoring. Have we improved nature? Have we done? We haven't got any baseline data. So hopefully we can influence that and have that whole farm approach. The attitude of Labour is about people, society, fairness. Hopefully we'll see more of that come through, so we get that range of stuff. My downside is a lot of talk about growth and buildings and infrastructure and stuff. We can't just focus on growth and extract more from our planet and from our soils and our system. So we've got to put that check in there. We've got to have that balanced growth that we all benefit, not one or two organisations or developers or planners.
Yeah. Christopher at the front.
Thanks very much. Christopher Stopes from Organic Farmers and Growers. I've been really interested in that last question about how you rate your respective devolved governments. And it seems that the differences illustrate quite a lot of the fundamental issues that we need to deal with. And I also tied it back to that question about land ownership and things like Conacre or the Crofters or whatever. Each of these are really crucial in framing a future agricultural policy. And to take the example of Conacre, the arguments for removing it are really strong and have been for many, many years. And we can look at each of the countries in their own way. But to have a policy that sort of unifies seems to me an ambition that we need to have. And for me then, thinking as an organic farmer, as a policy advisor to organic farmers and growers, organic represents that multifunctional system that gives the outputs that we're looking for. And Martin, I was specifically interested in thinking of your pick and mix analogy, which it is. And actually, if you pick and mix as an organic farmer, you can do rather well, as the OF&G estimates have shown, both from bringing together SFI and countryside stewardship. So what I wanted to understand, and maybe it's a question for Martin, is considering all of those reasons why we've got to pick and mix, and we've been sitting for those interminable hours in those stakeholder groups of DEFRA, considering why we've got this pick and mix approach, how does that link in to the fact that we can't take a system level way of approaching the problem that we've got, which needs a multifunctional system, which needs a definition, which needs a standard? Organic is such a standard, as an example is often used, and yet we don't have a coherent policy to encourage it. Do you think we've got scope to do that in England and in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland?
I would turn it round in a way and say, if we don't, we're not going to get the outcomes we want. Because we haven't got that whole farm approach around where we put stuff and how the actions we get rewarded for and the system of food production joins up, and how we've all got, nations have got targets of reducing pesticides, increasing biodiversity. So how is that system approach gets you down? And the ultimate goal, I think, for many, will be that organic system, because that removes many of those input products. But for many farmers, that's not where we're going to get to at the end, because they are still scared of that journey. And we need to support that journey and work out. And some of my inspiration of why I've done what I've done over the last few years is going on to organic farms and understanding how they've done something that's actually got more output than me, who's brought a load of inputs in. And how do we share that knowledge to have a whole systems approach in what we do? And we need that communicated by government, and they're scared of communicating that to farmers, because it is quite a fundamental change in the business model that's currently we have.
Can we just get a response from everyone first, and then we'll...
I think... Yeah, I agree with. I kind of see nature-friendly farming. I sort of categorise it in two compartments, if you like. So, the pick and choose options. So you could create a pond, create a hedgerow, wildflower, field margin, whatever. And I think most farmers are on board with that and really proud of the work that they do and want to showcase it. The other side of nature-friendly farming is the systems approach to it. And I still think there's a bit of peer pressure and sort of unwillingness to change mentality involved within the industry. So I'll just use our chair for the network in Wales, Hywel Morgan, and Tony Davis, our vice chair, as examples of two farmers who have undertaken this journey from a semi-intensive farm into an organic, low-input, regenerative farming system. And the farm is more profitable, there's more nature, the quality of life has improved. But still, that's not enough for some. They still get peer pressured into saying, oh, yeah, that's not proper farming. You're not producing enough food. And I think that is a huge barrier in itself, that sort of, the peer pressure. But that's why the network was formed in the first instance, so that it gives the confidence for farmers to actually embark on that journey and speak to like-minded people, know what the challenges are, what the issues, and sort of work together to get where we want to achieve.
Great. Denise, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, and obviously as organic farmers, and we have an on-farm butchery, so we sell direct, we're pasture for life, so we have a zero-input beef fattening system, and we produce extremely good grades. So, and we farm between 200 and 700 feet. I mean, I don't want to blow our own trumpet, but it is a living example of what you're suggesting, that it can work. And obviously, as organic farmers, we've had to navigate our own market with other organic farms as well. So in terms of us as an example of a resilient system that can lead the pace on, in terms of response to the question, yes, we can do that. We've got that example, and other farmers can follow. But, we're also, in our cative peer-to-peer groups, experiencing issues of peer pressure, but there is a slow movement and a slow change. And our government wants 50% of Scotland in organic. And we do have policy advisors in Scotland from Denmark who can demonstrate that in Denmark it worked. So if it can work in Denmark, it can work in the UK. So what is the resistance? What's stopping it?
Phil, did you?
Yeah, on the first point in terms of that relationship between free choice, ultimate free choice, and something that's a bit more prescriptive, I think we're in a bit of an experiment where you've got Wales where it's one scheme with everything all in one go. And there's challenges in that because we've kind of tried that before in the CAP with greening, you could argue. And because the prescriptions weren't ambitious enough, it delivered diddly squat, essentially. Whereas in England, you've got the challenge where you've got a good number of options, but nothing that kind of stitches them together. So it'll be interesting to see what delivers the best outcomes or whether there's something as a middle ground. On the organic point, I agree. I think it's one of those things that requires other interventions as well in terms of procurement, for example, in terms of the infrastructure that Denise spoke about as well, and looking at some of those interventions in the food system as well as a scheme and a target to increase the level of organic land, essentially.
Can I just make a couple of very short points, if I may?
Pretty short, if possible, because there's a few other people who'd like to ask a question.
Sorry?
There's a few other people who'd like to ask a question, so just a short statement would be
just
fine.
to say then that organic farmers and growers have done some estimates of what a 10% or 25% land use policy, including organic, would achieve. And of course, it would achieve a 10% or 25% reduction in the use of artificial pesticides and artificial fertilizers. So we clearly can then deliver the change that's needed. So what we need to have is a recognition that a system can help deliver the outcomes that we need to deliver and make progress in that way.
Thank you, Christopher. On the left, in the middle over there. Yeah. The microphone's coming your way.
Thanks. Yeah, you've talked about the unjoined upness of national policy. I'm just wondering about local government policy, and in particular, the power that local authorities have through their local plans to influence land use. And I wondered if you could think of examples of policies or practices which are particularly blocking for the food economy generally, and or more positively, whether you can think of any examples of where a local authority has been able to in any way help to reinvigorate in the local food economy through supply chains or through more friendly, I mean, there's things like, being more friendly to polytunnels and agricultural accommodation and that kind of thing, or anything else. I wondered what the examples are. Thank you.
Rhys?
I'm aware of some sort of pilots and projects in Wales. That I know there are others in this room who can speak much more expertly about these. But I think the role of public procurement is really important. So there's some work down. I know work down in Carmarthenshire, sort of providing hospitals and sort of schools with sort of nature-friendly farming, local produce, and that can be a huge market for sort of regenerative nature-friendly farmers in Wales, and it can help tie that sort of link between consumers, especially children in school, with farmers. Sort of, so many people now don't know where their food comes from. So if you can create that link and the relationship at a very young age, get people interested in how the food is produced, the benefits, maybe there wouldn't be such a divide between the public and farmers, and it would be more of a relationship as opposed to a divide. So yeah, sorry, can't give you all the details, but there are some good stuff going on.
So in England, we have local nature recovery strategies every council's having to deliver. While they're focusing around local nature recovery, there's a whole opportunity in there about food systems, local markets and supply. And it's up to all of us to get engaged with your local councils if you're in England and try and influence them to get the right outcomes. This is a government directive that puts some funding in. What I see engaging with many of the councils, they're all doing it differently and having different objectives and putting different priorities in. We need to back to that framework. What are the priorities for this opportunity to deliver, and how do we prioritise food production alongside nature and other aspects in that landscape? So I think it's up to as many of us as possible to engage within it. If you're in England, engage in that process to make sure we have good strategies that councils and local structures can actually feed into and do good things.
Yeah, every council has to do a local food plan, so they should be trying to make that as ambitious as possible. And I know Sustain do a lot of work on sustainable food places, again, which is a brilliant place to start. One really good example in a Northern Irish context is Taste Causeway. So that is a local council that has really seen the opportunity for food-based tourism in an area, LFA, kind of disadvantaged landscape, and they've supported farmers to kind of work together and market that to tourists, but also to diversify into other forms of production as well. And I think examples like that should be shared far and wide, and councils can be quite creative to capitalise on local opportunities, essentially.
So in Scotland, with our Good Food Nation Act, every single local authority has got a legal commitment, I'm sure I'm right, aren't I, Ewan, in actually producing a local food plan. And we've got some exceptional examples in East Ayrshire County Council. So yeah, there is a government directive for local food plans, and it's only just starting. And I think government have committed something like £3 million to food laboratories to help local authorities explore places.
Great, thanks, Denise. And we. Pardon? Yes, yeah, I've got my eye on him. The gentleman at the back next to the screen. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, you can. Thanks, Will, and the panel for a really interesting discussion. My name's Andrew Stark from the Eating Better Alliance. So my original question was about policy divergence across the UK and the politics of that. But I feel like that discussion's been had, and as Rhys said, it's really easy to get sucked into the negative politics of that. So flipping that, what are the areas of commonality that the panel see across the sort of topics that we've spoken about today that they feel that they could do with more support with? And I suppose I'm asking this from the perspective of an alliance across the UK trying to support farmers on this transition to a more sustainable and healthy food system. So what are those sort of key topics or those things? And that could be commonalities in challenges or areas of progress or across the nature-friendly farming network. Be interested in those perspectives.
Yeah, I think the commonality is infrastructure. So infrastructure to actually provide infrastructure, bottling plants, dehusking plants, local abattoirs to shorten food chains across the UK. That's number one.
As for an alliance and for other organisations, I think it's around language that's not offensive to farmers doing the right thing, and about bringing those farmers along the journey and making them the centrepiece of what's good and what everyone else, other farmers can see. We see a lot of attention of focusing on attacking the bad, And actually, if we supported the good, the bad feels left out, and that will expose itself. So we don't need to be so negative to many farmers and putting all farmers in one system. Many farmers are trapped into a system because of past agreements and past business or supply chains. How do we support them in the language we use that's engaging and makes them welcome to come and join with other organisations and other conservation groups and others to have a collective of change? The Nature-Friendly Farming Network cannot change everything individually. No one organisation can. But collectively, we can make a bigger difference. But we need to put the farmers at the centre of that good stuff that's happening and make sure the spotlight's on them, and they can engage at different levels with their neighbours and their colleagues and other organisations that may not be doing that practice that we all think is a little bit better than others. So it's not demonising, but it's really putting the good stuff, not on a pedestal, because that's the wrong view, but putting a spotlight on what does good look like. So if you show me what good looks like as a farmer, I can go there, or I can go and talk to the farmer. Oh, I can do that. I don't do that. I can connect with that. But if we always show the negative, the first thing we do, we hate a lot of you because you're always moaning at us. People's backs go up. They get prickly. We've got to be welcome. We've got to support them in driving that change.
I'll just add to that. I think generally within the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, the discussions around farming and future policy is very positive, isn't it? We took the Welsh, the Senedd's Environment, Trade and Rural Affairs Committee out to our chair's farm, and I just remember one of the members of the Senedd saying, I'm surprised how positive this walk is and how optimistic you all are. So that was really nice to see, and I think that that can then, I think, help change the relationship between farmers and government as well. I think in Wales particularly, the relationship is quite hostile, and it's always almost seen as sort of the government is there to hand out money to farmers, and also the government's attitude might be sort of, you should be grateful for this. But I think it's now becoming more of a sort of a relationship, yeah? The Welsh government have a lot of targets to meet, environmental targets, climate targets, biodiversity targets. They can't do that without farmers. So now it's more of a relationship. This is a payment for you guys to help us deliver what we want, we can't do without you. So no, I think, yeah, we're in a positive place and we're getting there.
Do you want to come in? Either of you come in? Or shall we? Yeah, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Yes, here at the front.
Hello, I'm delighted by all the wonderful work you're doing as nature-friendly farmers. Thank you very much. However, I think there's just been yet another report that says that farmland birds are decreasing. And I think that the amount of organic farming is also decreasing. So do you feel that enough is being done? And do you think that biodiversity net gain will have a key role to play? And that is obviously something relevant to local authorities.
I think in terms of that relationship between biodiversity decline and the type of farming practices that we use, there's obviously a link. And the big thing, we do have evidence that demonstrates that with the right schemes in place, so when they're targeted, when there's advice, when there's decent payment rates, and when they're kind of joined together, you can see recovery. And there's examples across all 4 countries of groups of farmers doing absolutely amazing stuff, like species that are on the brink of extinction thriving in certain landscapes. So we know what to do, it's just scaling it up, I think, is the really big thing. And we're on the kind of precipice of doing that. And yeah, I think it's again, a positive step, and we're quite close to where we need to be, hopefully.
Yeah, just 2 examples. The soil bunting recovery in the south of England and the corn bunting recovery in east of Scotland are all farmers. So there's 2 really good examples of where actually species recovery is linked directly with influence on farmers and payments too. So there are lots of positive stories. We can turn this around.
I'll just add as well, I think a lot of the biodiversity issues is a legacy of inappropriate farming policy, which isn't necessarily the farmer's fault. Yeah. So the policies, the advice given to farmers, the market, it's all sort of focused on driving intensification, chasing yield, production, and just policies generally not speaking to each other. So, you know, afforestation policies, planting sitka spruce, one species plantations on sort of heather moorland next to, you mentioned ground nesting birds. It's, yeah, what good can become of that sort of thing? So it's going to take, I think it's going to take time to address those shortcomings. But yeah, I think the governments have realised that the past policies haven't worked, and we're as Phil say, we're on the cusp of addressing it. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, so the past policies have driven poor outcomes and poor value for public money, delivering farming outcome that hasn't always joined up. So it's not always the farmer's fault, it's what we're encouraged to do. My parents and grandparents were encouraged to... So we're actively encouraged to remove habitat off farm. Putting habitat back is going to take time for species to come back, and we need the right advice and support. So I think we can turn it around. I think the policy across the UK is going in the right direction, but we need those voices in there to make sure it delivers what it should do. On the organic, we need the market recognition and some customer recognition to pay the difference, but also to penalise the poor production stuff. It's uneconomical and put two products on the shelf, people buy on price. But if one's priced at a point that its unintended consequences aren't paid for, it's wrong. That market needs to work properly. And on the biodiversity net gain, whether that's a corporate payment or whatever, that's going to be very limited where that goes, what it does, and where the money. It's not going to have huge value. It's £500 million or whatever for the first few years. It's a lump, but the reality of it's not going to drive massive change right across the UK. And across the UK, it's not always joined up in the right way. But what we do need to see is private finance coming in to get the right outcomes from food supply chains, from other things, and make the whole system work in a constructive way. But farmers will need the advice to get the right actions in the right place to do the right thing, because we're getting told mixed messages of planting trees and doing this and doing that. But what habitat have we got that we need advice in the landscape, and that can be led by farmers and other organisations. So the agronomist's role, as a non-organic farmer, my agronomist now is my advisor in cover crops, soil health, biodiversity, where we put in habitat across the farm. And then where if we need to use a product afterwards, we need to change the management. But he's having to retrain his system, and he's needing to make his company support him in that thing. That advisor on the ground is already there in many farms, whether it's a vet, whether it's your agronomist or somebody else in your landscape. But they need a retraining to help deliver whole farm vision around how we change our farms.
Phil, did you want to come in on this?
Wanted to add two quick things, because in terms of specific management for specific species and habitats, organic is great, but you need to have the specific kind of scheme on top of that to deliver what that needs. There's not a guarantee that as a farm's organic that it's essentially good for particular farming birds, for example, not always. So I think it also needs that land management scheme over it. And on the advice side of things, just building on Martin's point, it's that need for advice to be recognised as an investment within the agriculture budget and to be factored into it, because there's been some analysis to look at it. It's relatively low cost, and you get so much more in terms of the environmental outcomes, farmer buy-in, all the stuff that you need to actually push this on the right track.
Okay, I fear that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to our brilliant panel. I found it really interesting, and I hope everyone has a great conference.